Hello, I'm Dawn Balmer, Chair of the Red Breeding Bird Panel and BTO representative on the panel. This evening, I'm going to start off by showing you some recent trends in species and then move on and tell you how Red Breeding Bird Panel data are used. Like me, you probably vividly remember seeing your first little egrets in Britain. Mine was on the Hale Estuary in Cornwall in 1989, and I remember taking the train down from Plymouth, where I was a student, down to the Hale, and there it was on the estuary, amazing. Little did we know at the time how this species was going to expand and colonise as a breeding species. If we have a look at the graph here at the top, which shows the panel data, the blue line showing the maximum total pairs and the red bars the number of sites, you can see how the species has increased dramatically in recent decades, and we now record about 1,400 pairs annually. Little egret is a fairly common and widespread species, and we can now use the Breeding Bird Survey to also produce a long-term trend. So bird watchers like you and I who do BBS squares go out to our randomly selected squares twice in the breeding season and count the birds. And through that mechanism, we can see this graph here, which shows that since 1994, when the scheme began, we've recorded an increase of 2,380. Spoonbill's also another recent colonist. And have a look at the graph here, and you can see how the species has increased dramatically since around 2010. So there were a few years where there was breeding evidence being shown, but it was in 1998 in Suffolk when breeding was confirmed. And this was the first confirmed breeding since 1668. The next year, there was a breeding record in Lancashire and Merseyside. Then over the next few years, further records in Suffolk and Dumfries and Galloway. But it was 2010 in Norfolk when the species really started to get a stronghold here. And if we have a look at the data for 2020, we can see that 28 pairs fledged 56 young. And also in that year, there were breeding records in Suffolk and Yorkshire and display noted in Scotland. Goshawk's a really interesting species and has also been increasing steadily over the last couple of decades. The main strongholds are in southwest England, Wales and mid-Scotland. I suspect goshawk's really under-recorded still, particularly in parts of southeast England. So it's a species that we can all help go out this time of year on lovely sunny mornings and look out for displaying goshawks, and make sure you submit the records in confidence to the county bird recorder, who then collates the records and passes them on to the Rare Breeding Bird Panel. Bearded tit is a species that can show annual fluctuations. So if we have a look at the graph here, you can see the impact of cold winters in 1995 and also again in 2010, 2011. There can also be local declines, such as Leighton Moss in Lancashire in 2001, where there was severe winter flooding and poor reed setting, which impacted the local population. Quail is very well known for having these quail years where we get a big influx into the UK. And when we look at the graph here, we can see those years in 1989, 1997, and again in 2011. And it's thought the extreme temperature in France and Spain causes the birds to continue migrating north, overshooting and arriving here in the UK. Even in those really good years like 2010, when there's lots of birds, confirmed breeding evidence is still really hard to come by, and there were just 10 confirmed records in that year. Redback shrikes are declining species, as we all know. It was formerly fairly common and widespread species in the southern half of Britain, but by the time of the first atlas in 1968 to 72, it was already very much restricted to southeast England, with strongholds in the Brecks, New Forest and around the Suffolk coast. The population then continued to dwindle. So the famous pair in Santon Downham in Suffolk in 1988, and since then there's only been sporadic breeding, with records being split between Devon and northern Scotland mainly. The Slavonian Grebe has also been declining in recent years. This is actually a really well monitored species. There's lots of dedicated bird watchers up in northern Scotland who undertake surveys of most of the key lochs every year, so it's have really good annual coverage. You can see a drop around 93 to 94, then again a low point around 2000, and again in 2010. And since then, the population stabilised a little. One of the other things that's happened to Slavonian Grebe is that the range has become much more restricted, with places like Loch Ruthven, the RBBP reserve, being a really important site for them now. The field workers in Scotland are undertaking collaborative work with other field workers in Iceland and Norway to try and understand what's driving this population decline. Lesser spotted woodpecker was added to the panels list in 2010 as the sample size in the breeding bird survey was getting increasingly small. And we can really help here. The data submitted to the county bird recorders and onto the panel is going to be a really important source of information in years to come in providing short-term trends. So you can submit information in the usual way to the county bird recorder, such as through Bird Track here, where you can record the location, the number of birds, breeding evidence, such as a pair drumming herd, for example, and you can mark the record as sensitive. By the way, East Wretham, my local patch, is just wishful thinking. So how do we use rare breeding bird panel data? We can use it to help set conservation priorities, and panel data forms an important part of the Birds of Conservation Concern assessment. This is carried out every 6 years. And from that, we can produce a red list and an amber list. Currently, there are 25 panel species on the red list and 3 panel species on the amber list. This is the white-tailed eagle, redwing, and black redstart. And we also have 6 panel species listed as former breeders, such as golden oriole, snowy owl, serin, Kentish plover. Panel data also feeds into measuring the state of nature, such as the State of Nature published in 2019. The panel data is included with information from all other taxa. And this graphic on the right shows trends in abundance of 697 species of terrestrial and freshwater species. And it shows for the long term on the left and the short term on the right, the proportions of species that are showing declines, increases, or remaining largely stable. The panel data also feeds into the state of the UK's birds. This is published more or less annually. And we can produce either short-term or long-term trends for 51 species. It's a very nice summary of information covering 3 to 4 pages and provides a really good overview of annual information. We can also use panel data in assessing conservation action. So you'll be familiar with the bittern story. So bitterns became extinct in 1855 and then slowly started to appear again, starting off in Norfolk and building up numbers to around 80 booming males in the 1950s. Numbers then dwindled a little bit to a low point of 11 in 1997. RSPB, along with others, started to undertake conservation action by restoring reed beds, raising water levels, and creating new habitat, such as Lake and Heath Fen in Suffolk, just down the road from me. And you can see how bittern numbers have responded over time, up to every year's a record at the moment. So 2020, we had between 235 and 243 booming males. Panel data can also provide really information on site conservation. So panel data fed into this review of a special protection area network, and it can be used to identify SPAs. So how does the panel data fit into our broad suite of monitoring that we have here in the UK? We're very fortunate that we have schemes that cover the most numerous breeding species, such as the wren, to the rarest, like the purple sandpipers here. So the breeding bird survey covers the most common and widespread species, and every year reports on around 117 species. In addition, the Seabird Monitoring Programme monitors 25 breeding seabirds, from the most abundant like razorbill to the rarest like roseate tern and little tern. And we can add to that the periodic surveys covered by BTO. This covers around 10 species, for example, the woodcock survey we're running this year and a nightingale surveys we've run in the past. And then we have the scarab surveys. These are the scarce breeding bird surveys, usually coordinated by RSPB in conjunction with others. And this can monitor a suite of 30 species over a time frame. So this year we have a hen harrier survey underway. Then you can see how the panel data fits in, monitoring the rarest of the breeding birds. And we report on around 100 species annually in a report in British Birds. And it's real thanks to all these organisations that we have such a wealth of monitoring schemes in the UK. Mediterranean gulls are an interesting species, and in recent years we've been recording around 2,000 breeding pairs. And that's our threshold for a species to be on the rare breeding bird panel list. But it's really important before we take a species off the list that we're confident that long-term monitoring is in place. We're very fortunate that each year we receive near complete coverage of Mediterranean gulls, and we can produce graphs like this showing the increase over the last couple of years. But we need to be sure that the data is flowing through to the Seabird Monitoring Programme, who's responsible for that long-term monitoring. So we've got some work to do around data flows there. Panel data can also be used to enable research. And this is a really nice example of a paper that was published in British Birds on the recent history of breeding marsh warblers in Britain. Partnership of local birdwatchers who studied the species back in the day, and also the previous secretary, Mark Holling. We've also been able to use QUAIL data in a recent example, and you can see here the average latitude of all records of quail in 1986 to 2011. In fact, in 2014 data, it shows that 45% of all the quail records were in the northern half of Britain. And you can see on that graph how in more recent years, the average latitude has increased. We can also use panel data in the periodic atlases. So in Bird Atlas 2007 to 11, panel data was a really important source of information of breeding evidence, alongside casual records from birdwatchers, structured surveys, ringing, nest record data. And more recently, we've been able to use the panel data in the European Breeding Bird Atlas. We can also fulfill data requests, obviously using strict terms and conditions when we supply data. But you'll have heard in Sarah and Ali's talk yesterday how panel data was used in the designation of the Penwith Moors SSSI. And we also have summary data available on the Rare Breeding Bird Panel website. So you can go to Explore Reports and choose your species and pull out the extracts for you to have a look for yourself. So we do have some fantastic data feeding through to the Rare Breeding Bird Panel, but there are still many species for which there is low to medium annual coverage. So have a look at the list of species here. And if you're fortunate enough to be out bird watching during the summertime in suitable breeding habitat and see any of these species, then do make a special effort to record the information, send it through to the county bird recorder, and this will feed through to the panel. So I hope that's given you a flavour of how we use panel data, and really want to thank you, all the bird watchers, for submitting your records, the county bird recorders who collate the records and do a lot of sorting out before it's fed through to the panel, and the specialist groups and individuals that also submit data. Very many thanks to the funders, JNTC, RSBB and BTO. Thank you.